Economic Policy, Part 1. There are three basic economic problems that we might want to solve. Problem number one is unemployment, problem number two is inflation, and problem number three is economic growth. These are often phrased, and in fact in U.S. law they are phrased as full employment, stable prices, and economic growth, or something to that effect. The Federal Reserve has a law that says they're required to try to promote full employment, stable prices, blah, blah, blah. It's the job of the United States government to do that. So we don't all agree about things. The three basic questions we need to ask before we decide what to do. One is, should the government be involved in the economy? We know that some economists, classical economists in particular, don't believe that the government should be involved in the economy. Other economists do. Then we have the can question. There are economists who tell you that there's really nothing you can do. There are other economists who will tell you that there are times when you can or can't do something. So we have to ask this basic question of, can we do something about the economy? And then if we're going to answer yes to the first two of those, then we have the how question. What's our choice? What are we going to do? There are three basic policy choices for us. The first is called fiscal policy, the second is called monetary policy, and the third is called industrial policy. And we will go through these one at a time. So fiscal is a word that means budget. You probably have heard of a fiscal year, which would be a budget year. That means fiscal policy is about government spending and taxes, the budget. How much money do we spend? How much money do we take in? So we can increase or decrease government spending, and we can increase and decrease taxes, and those constitute fiscal policy changes. So in the last years, I'm talking about this, it's 2018, we increased government spending on things like defense, and we had a huge multi-trillion-dollar tax cut. That's fiscal policy. The government Congress has passed all kinds of programs like unemployment insurance that automatically work when the economy turns bad, when people lose their jobs. There's support programs for them. Those are automatic changes to fiscal policy. And other changes are discretionary. The tax cut in the last year was discretionary. The government decided to do it. It wasn't already programmed into law. Some of the things we've seen when the economy turned bad in 2007, 8, and 9, we had a couple of what are called stimulus packages. Stimulus packages are when the government intentionally spends money and cuts taxes to try to stimulate the economy to get it out of a recession. When times are good, we often see tax cuts or tax reform, and the difference there is we cut tax rates. So in the last year there's been tax rate cuts. That's a tax cut. Tax reform would be, for example, we retarget taxes so that more tax cuts come from rich folks. We took away the individual deduction. You used to be able to deduct $4,000 as a person. So if you had 10 kids, you had these huge personal exemptions. We got rid of those, and in their place we doubled the size of the standard deduction. So most people, when they do their taxes now, will just take that standard deduction, off it'll go. Tax reform could also be, for example, we wanted, and I'm saying we here in a general sense because it's America, it's us. Hundreds of billions, in fact, probably trillions of dollars of big corporations were sitting overseas, not brought back into the United States because of the taxes they'd have to pay. So Apple by itself had over $400 billion stashed overseas. By changing the tax code, you can encourage them to bring that money back in. What we wanted them to do, what we hope they do, is to invest that money, to put it into plant, equipment, and so on. But we didn't put anything in the tax code to encourage them. So we gave them a tax cut, but we didn't do tax reform, which means we didn't try to encourage certain behaviors from the tax system. So $1 trillion of the money that came back in was used to do stock buybacks, which help keep the price of the stock up, but don't do anything for the economy. So tax reform, we could have, for example, right now, if you move a factory overseas, the U.S. taxpayers help you pay for that. We could have changed that, for example, but we did not. Monetary policy is changing the money supply and changing interest rates. So the Fed can increase or decrease the money supply, and we've already talked about how they do that. They buy and sell bonds, right? When the Fed buys bonds, they're increasing the money supply. When they sell bonds they already own, that's decreasing the money supply. The Fed also controls these two interest rates, and we've talked about them before, the discount and the Fed funds rate. The discount rate is the rate that banks use when they borrow from the Fed. The Fed funds rate is the rate that banks pay when they borrow from each other overnight. It's usually an overnight borrowing. They have to have their minimum reserves in the bank, and so they may have to borrow to cover some of their obligations. That's the Fed funds rate. The Fed can increase those, and right now they've been slowly going through the process of bringing them up. They were in the mid-2000s in the 5.5 range. They were lowered down almost to zero, and now they're back into the 2.5% range, and the Fed wants to keep raising them. And then the Fed could, if they wanted to, change rules and regulations as a way to affect banking. We know the banks have to keep 12%. We can increase that. They don't do that very often. They can also require banks to take some of their excess reserves and put them into bonds. So the banks are capitalized not just by owning reserves that they have that they can pay out to their customers, but we also make them own government bonds, and we can increase the number of government bonds they have to own, and that gives them more financial stability. Some words you might hear floating around in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, a little later than that even. The Fed was increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. They called that quantitative easing. So there was QE1 and QE2 and QE3, and they were buying bonds. They normally buy just U.S. government bonds, but in these quantitative easings, because of the unusual nature of the financial crisis, they actually bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and other financial instruments that were out there, and they'd never done that before. The opposite of quantitative easing is a tight money policy, and that's where the Fed pulls money back in and raises interest rates. And then there's also what are called macroprudential policies. Those are policies designed to prevent problems in the first place. So the rules and regulations kind of thing. Or, for example, banks now have to undergo something called a stress test. They have to prove that if A happens, or B happens, or C happens, as A and B and C defined by the Federal Reserve as problems that might occur. If these problems occur, problem A or problem B or problem C occurs, they have to prove that they could weather that and be financially sound when it comes out. The third kind of policy is industrial policy. That's when we target specific industries. The Obama administration, as part of their stimulus package, targeted green energy and solar. The United States, generally speaking, is horrible at this. Japan's really good at it. Korea's really good at it. China's really good at it. Traditionally, the U.S., not so much. Again, the classicals and the new classicals, they believe in the power of the free market. They believe that free market always works the best. Even if it's not working perfectly, it still works better than the alternatives. We have that phrase laissez-faire that goes with that. And if a recession starts, a classical economist is going to tell you that the best thing the government can do is nothing. The government should let the economy work it out on its own. Keynes, the Keynesians, the new Keynesians, they believe that at times government intervention is necessary and required to fix problems in the economy. They may disagree about how exactly. Keynesians, the old school Keynesians, are very fiscal policy oriented. The new Keynesians weave monetary policy and fiscal policy together, and it all depends on the circumstances. So sometimes the government says, hey, we solved this problem, or we can't solve this problem, or an economist will say we can just do X, Y, or Z. Turns out that there are often difficulties associated with fixing economic problems, and that will be our next little video and our last little video.